I returned home after work with an unpleasant feeling in my stomach. I didn't know why, but I felt like I would soon find out. It was only 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. This was unusual for me since I work on my own and usually spend Friday evenings alone in the office to make sure everything is in order and ready for the important day on Saturday. My name is Mark Barker, and my business is called Barker Autos. I started my career at the age of 16 as an automobile mechanic. At 20, I opened my own auto repair shop, specializing in luxury European cars. Now, I am 38 years old. I have 4 locations in the district and own a business that, by the most conservative estimates, is worth $8 million. I was heading home because my wife, Hannah, had told me I needed to be home early. Today, she has an important offer and wants to talk to me about it. Hannah is 35 years old, and we've been married for 14 years. We met because her father asked me to find a car for her 20th birthday. A spark immediately ignited between us, and the day she picked up the car, she asked me out. A year later, we got married, and now we have 2 children, James, who is 12, and Martin, who is 10. Hannah's father, John, is an accountant, but a very pleasant person. He is a partner in an accounting firm and dedicates a lot of time to helping me in the business. Hannah's mother, Stephanie, calls me the chubby monkey and makes it clear that she thinks her daughter could do better than me. She has an older brother, Alexander, everyone calls him Alex, and a younger sister, Susan. Alex never got married, and it's clear he has no intention of doing so. Susan is married to a lawyer named Barkley, who envisions himself as some sort of shark, but in reality, he makes a living as a litigation attorney. Hannah's mother considers him the best son-in-law in the world. Something happened to Susan in her early adolescence. I never knew exactly what, but she had to undergo surgery as a result of which she couldn't have children. As a result, our 2 children turned out to be the only grandchildren. Stephanie seems upset about this, but Susan fell into depression as her mother only talks about having grandchildren. Hannah cares about her sister. During a family gathering, I suggested they adopt a child, but Stephanie exploded, saying she wanted her grandchildren to be biologically hers. Hannah's next suggestion was surrogacy. Susan asked how it could be done, and I explained in vitro fertilization as best as I could. Stephanie wrinkled her nose again, saying it was too complicated, and asked who the egg donor would be. Later that night, Hannah and I discussed Susan's issue. I offered to donate my eggs for in vitro fertilization. Hannah asked how it would be done, and I told her I would study the topic. It turned out that extracting eggs wasn't that difficult, and I brought this information home. This way, Stephanie will be able to have biological children, and everything will be fine in the world. This conversation took place about 3 months ago, and since then, this topic has come up seemingly casually every 2 or 3 weeks. The reason I had an unpleasant feeling in my stomach is that for the past week or so, Hannah has been acting a bit strange. I couldn't understand what was going on, but she was texting someone. She's usually completely open with her phone, but in this case, she was being secretive. Also, we haven't been intimate for over a week. The house is not visible from the road, so when I headed towards it, I only saw a few parked cars, and I realized my bad feelings were justified when I saw John and Stephanie's car, Susan and Barkley's car, and several other people I knew as more distant relatives. I felt like a lot of trouble was looming, and they were going to pretend everything was fine. I parked at the house and walked in, prepared for the storm ahead. I deliberately entered through the garage door, knowing they wouldn't hear me. I stayed in the utility room and listened, but I could only hear muffled voices. I always carry a dictaphone in my pocket. John taught me this when I went to a meeting to take my notes. At the end of it, out of habit, I turned on the recorder and placed it back in my pocket, confident it would capture most of the conversation. I understood it was about to take place, taking a deep breath. I opened the door and entered the kitchen. 8 people were seated in the corner by the kitchen. Hannah, John, and Stephanie were sitting on a 3-seater sofa. Susan and Barkley were on a double sofa. Alex was in an armchair, and Joan and Karen, 2 aunts, were in chairs brought in from the dining room. Only the chair that had been moved from my home office remained empty. It was positioned in a way that Alex and the 2 aunts surrounded it and was directly in front of Hannah and Stephanie. Clearly, it was a prepared ambush. As I closed the door behind me, Hannah said, "Come in, Mark, and have a seat." We're discussing some things and would like to hear your opinion. I thought, we would like to hear your opinion. So now they're going to offer me something, and I, as expected, won't have a choice. I headed to the corner but turned one of the bar stools and sat on it. I wanted to change the atmosphere in the room, and by sitting on a high stool, I not only distanced myself from the rest but also made myself taller, meaning they would have to look up at me. I said nothing but looked directly into Hannah's eyes, my face showing a lot of irritation. She blushed when she realized what I was doing but couldn't maintain my gaze. I slowly looked around the room. John and Alex weren't looking at me. Stephanie had a triumphant expression on her face, as if she was about to achieve her long-desired goal. Barkley was looking me in the eyes and smiling as if he was about to best me. And a smile appeared on Susan's face that hadn't been there for a long time. Hannah remained silent, waiting for me to speak, but I didn't. Looking around the room, I continued to gaze at her, and she tried to avoid my gaze in every possible way. I thought, I can wait as long as you and remain silent. It turned into a battle, and she started to get angry with me. Finally, Stephanie broke the silence, saying, "We've been discussing Susan's problem, and it seems we found a solution." No, I said nothing to Stephanie and continued to look at Hannah, who was now uneasy under my gaze. Finally, Hannah looked up at me. "Mark, as you know, Susan can't have children, and you've studied the possibility of surrogacy. We think it's a good option. Mom wants the eggs to be biologically related to the family. So, in the past few weeks, we've been discussing the option where I'll be the surrogate mother." I raised my hand to stop her. "You've been discussing this in the past few weeks. And why did you find it necessary to exclude me from these discussions? Obviously, this decision will have a significant impact on me and the children, and I believe we should have been kept informed about all of this." Stephanie intervened. "What do you mean?" "It has nothing to do with you. Just hold her hand and smile." I took a deep breath and addressed Stephanie without taking my eyes off Hannah. "Naturally, it will affect me and the children. Their mother will be in an in vitro fertilization clinic, then she'll carry the baby, which means she won't be able to do some things for them. Both previous pregnancies were tough for her, and both times she was hospitalized for a month with high blood pressure. She'll have to undergo scrutiny and spend time in the hospital during childbirth, which will erase her from their lives. She'll also need time to recover. It takes a certain degree of selfishness not to understand how destructive this will be for my family." What concerned me the most was that when mentioning in vitro fertilization clinic, Hannah's gaze wandered around the room. A smile appeared on Barkley's face, and Susan shivered. "What am I missing, Stephanie?" I asked. Evidently, she enjoyed filling me in. There won't be an in vitro fertilization clinic. My grandchild will be conceived in love and passion, not in a test tube. A light bulb went off. This is an ambush, and the others are here to keep me under control. I felt anger rising on my face and shouted, "Hannah, explain everything now." She turned her gaze toward me, and I saw fear in her eyes. The conversation wasn't going as she had planned, and now the truth had been revealed, and she had lost control of the conversation. She said, "In vitro fertilization isn't the best option. 2 months ago, I stopped taking birth control pills. Doctors say in about 2 or 3 weeks, I'll become fertile again. During my fertility window, Barkley will move in with me for a week, and by the end of the week, I should be pregnant. After that, Susan and Barkley can adopt a child who will be biologically native to both." By this time, I was standing right in front of Hannah, and I felt Barkley's hand on my shoulder. I tried to break free, but he was holding my shoulder firmly. I heard his words, "Hold on, Mark, please don't do anything foolish." I addressed no one in particular and said, "I won't do anything foolish." Now I turned to everyone and said, "Get out of my house." Stephanie tried to insist on her point of view. "We don't have to make an agreement and decide if you'll stay in the house when this happens." John had already stood up and was trying to lift his wife when I said, "John, I've never hit a woman before, but if your wife doesn't leave this house in 10 seconds, God knows I will." At that moment, Stephanie looked me in the eyes and for the first time realized the truth of my words. She jumped up and asked, "Han, don't you need Alex to stay for protection?" I laughed. If you think I'm going to physically harm my wife, you don't know me. If you think this nonsense will end well for our marriage, then you really don't know me at all. Hannah gasped and then said, Mom, please, go. The rest of you, leave. Mark and I have a lot to discuss. When everyone left the house, I went to my office and locked the door. First, I downloaded the conversation that had just taken place and then restarted the recorder. While doing this, Hannah shouted, Mark, I've never seen you behave so rudely with anyone. You should come out here and discuss everything like an adult. My goodness, she's throwing all this nonsense at me and getting mad at me for being angry, I thought to myself. I laughed but didn't say anything. At work, we have a system to record all calls, and messages are recorded as part of our CRM system, which has saved us more than once when billing additional jobs. Hannah's phone was an office phone, so all her messages were recorded, though they were stored in the trash folder. I quickly accessed her recordings and downloaded all voice calls and messages between her mom, Susan, and Barkley. In fact, it all turned out to be straightforward. They created a group called Baby, which included Hannah, Susan, Barkley, and Stephanie. I slowly went through the group messages. The discussion started 3 months ago, right after the mention of surrogacy. It all began with Hannah offering to donate eggs for a surrogate mother and then turned into her being the surrogate mother herself. Stephanie played a key role in how conception would take place, and Barkley eagerly made suggestions. Stephanie kept insisting that the child had to be conceived in passion. She had some irrational belief that a child conceived in a test tube wouldn't have enough emotional maturity. It took me about an hour to gather my thoughts, and I also took the opportunity to contact my lawyer and ask for a recommendation for a divorce attorney. After leaving the office, I found Hannah sitting in a corner, sipping a glass of wine. The initial outburst of anger had passed, but her face still held a lot of fury. I looked at her suddenly. You thought I would swallow this sudden nonsense? Her anger flared up again as she replied, What do you mean by nonsense? We agreed on how to help my sister get out of her depression, and you're acting like a spoiled child, literally throwing my family out of my house. I just laughed. You want to commit adultery under the pretext of supposedly providing a child for your sister, and you're mad at me for rejecting you? Hannah, see and think about what you're offering. And remember, this is also my house, and anyone who disrespects me in it will experience all my anger. The word divorce left her speechless, but she regained her composure and said, If you divorce me, I'll leave you penniless, paying child support for the kids and alimony, and I'll also get half of the business, which I'll sell to anyone who buys it. I started laughing again. I hope you haven't taken enough of Barkley's advice. Not only is this advice bad, but it will also lead to me revoking your beneficiary status on your shares. But let me explain that not only this house but also the land it stands on came into my possession before we got married. It's not marital property. We both signed a prenuptial agreement. You have no claim on my business, and I have no claim on the business you and your father jointly run. If you plan to get pregnant, especially by a man who's not your husband, your medical history will show that you won't be able to care for the children. Don't forget that during both pregnancies, you were hospitalized due to high blood pressure. Hannah, if you want a dirty fight, I'll give it to you. You won't become pregnant with Barkley's baby. If you plan to stay married to me, and I won't accept IVF because I no longer trust you, you've made this a win or lose situation, and the win is our marriage. And now, where are the kids? I want to see them. She realized she had halted the discussion and would have to backtrack. She said, They're at the Pattersons' house at number 30, and I'm going to get them now. Please, cook dinner. I left a couple of pizzas in the fridge. I heated up the pizza and then played with the kids in the garden until bedtime. I knew I had to talk to Hannah, but I just couldn't bear this conversation. Both kids went to bed around 9:30 at night, as I had exhausted them and myself playing soccer in the garden. Finally, I reached the point where I couldn't hold back any longer. I went to the fridge for a beer and walked over to the corner where Hannah was sitting in the only chair. I sat down in front of her on the 3-seater sofa, took a long sip of beer, and said, Did you really think I would agree to you betraying me? And if you had a baby for Susan, did you expect me to clear my own bed? I don't think you understand the contempt and humiliation you plan to throw on me. I noticed Hannah's sad expression when she said, "I have to do something for Susan. My sister is completely depressed. My mother hates IVF, and Barkley says they can't afford it anyway. If you don't let me, I'm afraid Susan will harm herself, and she'll never forgive me if she does." So, is this blackmail? You're turning me into a cuckold, so there's no way you and Barkley can arrange this to get pregnant. If you can't afford IVF, we'll give you the money, or we can go halves with your parents if your mother doesn't like it. Then it's their problem. To be clear, I've already asked the company lawyer for a recommendation to a divorce attorney. I'm serious. Do this, and we'll part ways, and don't put the expenses on me. I won't stay married to a traitor, and if you do that, you'll become one, I said. She ran out of the room crying, and I heard the bedroom door slam. I didn't know if she locked it, but I decided I wouldn't sleep beside her that night. The idea that she might try to seduce me was repugnant, and I wanted her to know how it would feel if I did the same. I entered the office, closed the door behind me, and checked her message history. It turned out they were exchanging text messages in a group. Susan was clearly distressed, saying this was her only hope, and she didn't know what she would do if she didn't have a child in her arms. Hannah began by saying she would work on me. I checked my email, and Tony, the company lawyer, responded to my letter. The email said a lawyer would write to me with their demands. I replied, and we discussed everything. Then I closed the computer, opened the sofa bed, and went to sleep. I woke up because someone was trying to open the office door. Then I heard a thud and a half scream from Hannah. "Mark, what are you doing? Why didn't you come to bed?" I got up and looked at my watch. It was 3:30 in the morning. I unlocked and opened the door and found Hannah standing in the hallway in her bathrobe. It was half open, and she was wearing nothing underneath. I looked at her in silence. "What's the problem?" She replied, "I've been waiting for you in bed. I thought we could at least cuddle and take the opportunity to talk calmly and figure out how I can assure you that your jealousy is unfounded." Obviously, there were more messages in the group, and I didn't want to reveal that I had access. So, I left it as it was. "Good night, Hannah. Go to bed and take this opportunity to reflect on the damage you're doing to our marriage, how you're neglecting my feelings and self-esteem." I closed and locked the door, turned off the light, but stood by the side of the door listening. There was light under the door, and I knew Hannah was still there. I thought I heard a sigh, and then the light went off. The next day was Saturday, and I usually left work later on Saturdays, but I left early that day. I assumed Hannah would change her approach. Last night's tactic was the usual one. She could have taken one of two paths, either becoming very kind to show me what a good wife and mother she was, hoping I wouldn't notice her infidelity, or becoming a hellish woman trying to demonstrate that if I didn't give in to her desires, she would make my life a constant misery. I assumed today would be the former, and then she would take the opposite approach. I stayed in the office until around 4:30, after everyone had left. I just couldn't muster the strength to go back home. I realized our marriage is like a mirror, and Hannah threw a very large brick at it. The mirror is broken, and it will now always be broken. I began to think our marriage was doomed. No matter what I did, I arrived home around 5 o'clock. Of course, Hannah was in the kitchen, wearing her figure-hugging summer dress and flawless makeup. Normally, I would have practically attacked her in the kitchen, but this time, I didn't even pay her any attention. I went to the guest bedroom to change. After about 20 minutes, she called from upstairs, "Mark, dinner is ready." I had to give a good impression to the kids, but I wanted to make sure Hannah understood that this image of her as a loving wife wouldn't change my decision. When I went to sit down, there was a glass of red wine prepared for Hannah and me. Then she came to the table carrying a plate with steak, a generous serving of French fries, and mushrooms, my favorite Saturday dinner. Nothing surprising. I hardly paid attention to Hannah, talking with the kids about everything she couldn't talk about. She tried to change the subject, but I didn't let her. The kids didn't notice, but she did. After lunch, she said, "Mark, help me with the dishes, and the kids will go out and play for a bit." I got up and started clearing the table, but Hannah stayed seated. When she heard the kids playing with the console, she said, "Mark, sit down and talk to me. What's going on?" I returned to the table and sat down. Then I said, "Can you really ask that with a straight face?" If you don't know what's going on, then this marriage has even bigger problems than I thought. Allow me to explain it to you. You're planning to betray me with the clear intention of getting pregnant by someone else. You also understand that I don't buy it, and that's why you're putting on a show of being a loving wife for me, trying to pretend that if I let you do it, then you'll be the best wife and mother a man could wish for. But it won't work. If you do it, you'll never be a good wife again. Just to be clear, I've already contacted a divorce lawyer, and I'll end our marriage if you continue down this path. Her expression changed from being a loving and smiling wife to being a nasty person. Her voice was a whisper, but anger was evident. She retorted, "Let me clarify the situation. I decided to do this for my sister. If you can't accept it, then let's get a divorce." It sounded like a threat. I think she thought I was putting on an act. I took a deep breath and said, "Today, I was sitting in the office thinking about what makes a good marriage. Marriage is like a mirror, and now you're throwing stones at our mirror. The problem is, our mirror is broken, and no matter how much we try to put it back together, it will always have cracks. I have a terrible premonition that now our marriage has a crack, and in the end, like a broken mirror, it will shatter. I'm not joking. It's not something I can bear. You're choosing them, not me or the kids. You have very little time to prove that we are the most important thing in your life. If you don't, then, well, there will be nothing left for you and me." I got up from the table and went to the kids' room. We played video games all night. I had a clear sense that our family was falling apart, and I felt very sad. The next few weeks went on in the same way. Hannah did everything to be the perfect wife. Every time she tried to talk about the baby, I told her the same thing, that it was a reason to end the relationship. She stopped being so toxic but became more reliant on me. One evening, Susan came to have dinner with us. After we finished, Hannah invited me to a corner. Susan started the conversation. "Mark, my life won't be complete without a child. I really need it, and what Hannah is willing to do is the greatest gift they can give me. You can't open your heart to me." I looked at Hannah to make sure she understood that I could see this ambush from miles away. And then I said, "Susan, there are several ways to achieve it. Turning Hannah into your personal sinner is not one of them. Look now." Directly at Susan, but I heard Hannah sigh and continued. "Maybe life has treated you unfairly, but I'm serious. If you continue down this path, our marriage with Hannah will be over. Are you willing to sacrifice this for your personal reasons? There are other issues that haven't even been mentioned. What if Barkley can't get the job done on the first try? It will become a monthly event until you get pregnant. It took us 9 months to conceive James and 5 months with Martin on the side." I noticed Hannah looking away, obviously hoping I hadn't thought of that. Then I asked, "And will one child be enough, or will you decide that an only child is a lonely child and declare that you need another to complete your ideal family?" Susan's face turned red, and Hannah started playing with her nails. I looked around and said to Hannah, "So you've been thinking about this, haven't you? And you won't do it just once. God, you're so cunning. I have no doubt you're imitating your mother." I got up, and Susan and him got up with me. Susan was crying, but Hannah's facade dropped again, and she was angry, saying, "Mark, I never thought you would be so stubborn. We've given you every opportunity to solve this problem intelligently, but you refuse. I'm going to Susan and Barkley's on Friday night, and I'll be there for a week. Face it on your own. Well, don't bother coming back here. They'll serve you at their place on Friday, and your things will be in the garage." As I left the kitchen to go to my room, I texted Liam. "She's going through with it. Starts this Friday." Liam called me, and after a brief hello, he asked, "Do you know what her plan is?" Judging by what I just heard, she's going to their house on Friday after work and plans to stay there over the weekend and the entire following week. "Very well," said Liam. "We should serve her on Friday when she leaves work. It will give her time to change her mind and look good in front of the judge." Until Thursday night, the house felt like a freezer. When the kids went to bed, she tried to get close to me, but I didn't hug her, not even when she tried to lift my hand and place it on herself. Finally, she said, "Mark, it's just 1 week of our lives. How can it change anything? I stepped away from her and stood up. Then Han said, "This is going to change everything. You're leaving me for another man. When you come back, you won't be a faithful wife anymore. I'll never be able to touch you without thinking about it. If you really believe this is just 1 week of our lives, then you truly ignored me at every stage of the planning. If you go to their house tomorrow, we're done." Han looked sad, but she tried her best to maintain eye contact with me, and I tried to keep eye contact with her. She said, "Mark, I'm not leaving you for anyone. All I'm going to do is carry out my sister's pregnancy." I took a deep breath. "You really don't understand, do you? You are leaving me. You prioritize her wishes and interests over mine and the children's. You're going away for a week, and you don't care about what we do, what I tell the kids, worse yet, what will happen when their friends find out what you did. And if you don't get pregnant this month, you'll do it every month until you do. I hope you understand what I'm talking about, and if you decide to go ahead, at least you'll understand that what happens next inevitably depends on your actions." Han was sitting with her mouth open when I left the room and went upstairs. I heard her running after me. I entered my room and locked the door. A few seconds after closing the door, I heard her knocking and saying, "What do you mean by what happens next is inevitable? What are you planning?" I opened the door. "I have already told you. You need to think carefully and decide what your priorities are." Then I closed the door again. By 10 in the evening, I was in bed and slept more soundly than ever since this whole mess began. I've done all I could. Future actions depend on her. The next morning, I decided not to leave for work early. While preparing breakfast for the kids, Han entered the kitchen with a travel bag. She looked at me with a certain concern on her face, then turned around and placed the bag in the laundry room, where I couldn't see it. I continued preparing breakfast for the kids and said, "I see you've made your decision." I heard her going to the closet to get something for herself. "I thought you would have left by now." I had my back to her. "I thought we should eat together one last time." Even then, she stopped moving, but I knew she caught my meaning when she said, "What do you mean by eat together one last time?" "Those are a couple of mysterious words you told me recently." "There's nothing mysterious about them, Han," I said. "I've made it clear what would happen if you continue down this path. You simply chose to ignore my exceptionally clear warnings." She turned to face me, and I turned to face her for the first time since this mess began. She realized I was serious. There was concern written on her face when she said, "I can't back down now. I'm afraid for Susan's mental health if I don't do this." I shrugged. Our family ceased to be the most important thing a long time ago. Then I yelled, "Kids, breakfast is ready." I grabbed my keys and said, "See you later." I walked alongside her to the door. She grabbed my hand, not even a farewell kiss, to which I replied, "No, thanks. I don't want to take anything away from Barkley." I let go of her hand before she could move and headed for the door. When the door closed, I heard her crying, "Mark, please. I need you to be there for me when I do this." Throughout the day, Han and Susan called me repeatedly, and even Stephanie called, but I didn't answer any of those calls. At 4 in the afternoon, my secretary called me and said that John was on the phone. I said, "Connect me," and waited. "Hello, Mark. I know it's a lousy situation, but it's become a battle of wills. And thought you would agree, but you fought every step of the way. Now she believes that if she backs down, she'll feel like a loser. What can be done to fix this?" I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, John, but there's nothing we can do to fix this. If I allow this to happen, I'll lose my self-respect. I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror again, and I'll never be able to touch Han. Han created this situation herself. If she had thought for a moment, she would have realized I would never allow this in my life. To be honest, I think our marriage is irreparably broken, and your assessment of her unwillingness to back down only confirms it. I'm sorry, John, but if she doesn't come back home tonight, it will all be over between us." Then I said, "Han says you mentioned that I was going to divorce her. Is that true?" "Yes, Mark," John replied. If she goes through with this, I'll divorce her. The documents are already prepared, and she'll be served if she proceeds. Ian took a deep breath and asked, "Will you uphold the prenuptial agreement?" I'm glad you remembered, because Hen forgot. Yes, I will. Because I want to protect my business and the house. It was mine before the marriage. I'll be fair to her, but not overly generous, I said. There was silence for a few seconds until Ian said, I probably would do the same if I were in your shoes. I warned Stephanie not to go down this path, but she said in your relationship with Han, you're overstepping and that you'll let her do it just to avoid losing your social status. I know you much better, and I should have insisted. We finished the conversation by thanking each other. I suspect the next conversation with John or the rest of the family won't be as friendly. I decided to go back home early. The kids are staying with Mrs. Neal, our neighbor, and I need to settle into a new rhythm of life because their lives are about to change completely. When the phone rang, it was John again. He simply said, Mark, they filed for divorce today. Yes, John, I told you what I was going to do. Now she knows how serious I am. Now it's time for her to make a decision. Me and the kids are Susan and Barkley. There was silence for a few seconds. Then Ian said, she's in shock. Stephanie is ready to tear you apart, and Susan has fallen into such a deep depression that we can't even communicate with her. I'm sorry, John, but now you know how I've felt for the past 3 weeks. It's not my fault, but I have no choice. Tell Anne that her actions will give me the answer. If she comes back home, we can talk, and if not, then I'll understand that I'm second in her priorities. With that, I hung up the phone. I didn't need Y's response and went home, picked up the kids, and ordered pizza for dinner. If Hen comes back home, it will be a war zone. We had already finished dinner, and I was starting the dishwasher when I heard the sound of a car approaching. I looked out the window and saw Stephanie and Han getting out of the car. I told the kids to go to their rooms and play on the computers, and I went to the living room. I now hated this room because so many bad things had happened in it lately. Stephanie was the first to burst through the door, closely followed by Hannah. There was fury on her face, but John held her back. Stephanie, we're here to help, not to make things worse. You should let Mark and Hannah talk. Stephanie turned sharply. How could we make things worse? This man simply prevents us from having grandchildren. I won't stand for it. I saw the look on John's face and suspected that Stephanie, even in her anger, had caught the same look and had the sense to stay quiet. Hen walked in behind her as if she were heading to the gallows, holding a brown envelope in her hand, clearly in tears. She sat on the couch, looking at me while I sat in the only chair. John seated Stephanie at the kitchen table and then made coffee. Han looked at me with red eyes. Is this your final word on this matter? I responded briefly, yes. Is there really no room for negotiation? Han asked again. I was so disgusted by the way I had been treated that I felt sick even thinking about her question, so I wasn't going to have much compassion for any of them. Han, I've already said it 3 weeks ago. But you simply wanted to do it your way. I don't think I can trust you not to sneak behind my back and betray me. So it's too little, too late. You can donate eggs and hire a surrogate mother, I'll even pay for it, but you've treated me with such contempt that I won't accept you carrying out the pregnancy. I saw this starting to infuriate her again, but John put his hand on her shoulder. Stephanie, you don't have to get involved in this. It's our fault. Han and Mark have to figure it out on their own. Han was crying silently. She didn't want to be the villain in this situation, but it was clear that they were all going to make it seem that way. Han looked up. I don't want to get a divorce. I need you. How do we fix this? I took a deep breath. To be honest, so much water has already flowed under this bridge that I don't know if we can. But let's try. The first thing we need to do is put an end to this whole sentence. If you want to continue acting as a surrogate mother for Susan, I'll proceed with the divorce. Then we need to rebuild our marriage. I gave you the opportunity to be yourself, but you seem to take it as something I would agree with no matter what. A wife respects her husband as an equal. She would never offer what you're offering. So we need to think about how to fix a broken mirror. Using the phrase broken mirror made her react. You said it before, she said. You said a broken mirror can be repaired, but there will always be a visible crack. That's how our marriage is going to be. I looked her in the eyes and said, I'm afraid so, at this point. Stephanie was beside herself with indignation. She argued, and what about poor Susan? You're robbing her of her only hope to have a child. Without looking away from Han, I said, Han, you can donate your eggs at the clinic. They will be fertilized with Barclay's material in a test tube and implanted in a surrogate mother. They offer that service. But Han, as soon as they remove your eggs, I hope they perform a tubal ligation on you. A few years ago, we decided not to have any more children, but instead she didn't want to be sterilized. She took pills to eliminate the possibility of accidents. When I mentioned tubal ligation, she turned pale. Please don't make me do this. I just shook my head. You really don't understand what's going on. You were willing to play with your body. The only way I can ensure that you won't do it again is by taking your body out of the equation, meaning making sure you can't get pregnant the old-fashioned way. I'm sorry, Han, but when you play with fire, you can get burned. I don't know if Han was devastated or furious. She was crying when Stephanie spoke again. You're truly heartless. I turned around and said, I've learned from the best, Stephanie. Han agreed to be sterilized if I stopped the divorce. We agreed that I would suspend the divorce and annul it on the day she went to the hospital for sterilization. A month later, we were sitting in an in vitro fertilization clinic. The clinic helped Sarah and Barclay find a surrogate mother, and we each paid them $100,000. The egg retrieval procedure was straightforward but left Han with slight discomfort. A week later, Han went to the hospital for sterilization, and I went to the judge to withdraw the divorce petition, which he granted without objections. Life seemed to go on as usual, but our once very active life had turned into routine. We would regularly sit in different chairs in front of the TV at night with nothing to say to each other. The surrogate mother was implanted with 2 viable eggs about a month after the collection. Unfortunately, in the 3rd month, she lost the fetus. No other eggs were viable, and Han could no longer provide them. Han stopped hosting family events at our house, and I happily avoided events elsewhere. It doesn't take a genius to realize that we are essentially 2 people raising children who have a piece of paper saying we're married, but there is no real relationship. Everything I predicted has come true. Han proposed a hopeless situation, and such an outcome was inevitable. The loser, Han, couldn't stand the winner, me. So, 10 years passed. We did everything, the kids, sports, events, call it what you will. I was there, and Han was always with me. All the parents envied us. But at home, we had a different life. Of course, we shared a bed, but there was no intimacy. Story 2. My partner and I have been together for 5 years. Though we had recently gotten married, we actually met on a blind date that one of our mutual friends set us up on. I was new in town and didn't know anyone, so I jumped at the opportunity to meet someone. At the very least, I figured if there wasn't a romantic connection, I might possibly make a new friend. Though I was lucky when there was a strong romantic connection between my wife and me, she joked with me on the date that our mutual friend had always been trying to play matchmaker with her, but it never worked before. She spent the night, and from there, it was like she never left. We were completely inseparable from each other. I really thought that I found my best friend when I met her. That's what makes all of this so much harder on me. I was estranged from my family at a young age, and I had to work through a lot of complicated feelings toward them. My father was abusive toward me and my siblings, and I decided I didn't want anything to do with it. I was the only one to leave the family, and there was a lot of resentment toward me because of it. Even though I hated my father for what he did, there was still a part of me that loved him. It was very complex and hard to discuss with people. I shared everything with my wife, and she supported me through a lot of things early on in our relationship. About 6 months ago, I found out that my father had died. He was in a bad car accident, and it took the entire family by surprise. I was saddened by the news, but I also felt extremely guilty for having cut him off. My wife and I went back to my hometown to attend the funeral. While we were there, I was ignoring her a bit, not on purpose, but because I was very sidetracked with my familial problems. My siblings and my mother were very cold toward me after I abandoned them. We had a lot of things to work through, and I intended on trying while I was there. That left my wife alone in town for quite a while. Since we were there for about a week and a half, I never would have suspected she was cheating on me at the time, but looking back, there were a few things that I think might have been because of an affair. One night while we were in town, she didn't come to bed. I looked around the house for her, but I didn't see her anywhere. I called her to ask her where she was, and she told me that she needed to get out of the house and she was on a walk. I did wait up for an hour, but I was exhausted and fell asleep before she got home. I might have been a little too involved in the other things going on in my life to question her about it at the time, but now I think that's where this all began. After we went back home, things still weren't the same for me. I was mourning the loss of my father, and I was really grieving the fact that I hadn't spoken to him in years. There were a lot of things I never said to him that I wanted to, and I felt like that chance was taken from me. However, since he was no longer around, I thought it might be good to try and rekindle a relationship with my family. My wife thought that was a good idea, and she encouraged me to spend more time with them. Throughout all of that time, she was far away from me. It seemed like helping me work through some of these issues was the last thing she wanted to do. It was surprising because she had been so supportive of everything that I told her when we started seeing each other. It felt like I was living with a different person at times. She spent more time away from the house too. She would go out with her friends, and it felt like she was avoiding me. One night, I asked her about what was going on, and she just told me that she felt uncomfortable dealing with death, so she had distanced herself inadvertently because of that. I felt slighted by that because she was supposed to be there for me, but I didn't want to push her away anymore. I started dealing with my things privately after that. Even after I stopped going to her with the issues, she was still distant and absent from my life. Clearly, what she had told me was a lie because her behavior didn't change when mine did. I started to get suspicious that something was going on. It was the last thing that I needed to be dealing with at the time, so I thought I could ignore it. At least I thought I could do that. I was sitting on the couch next to her one night, watching a television show, and I saw a number come up on her phone. I didn't recognize the number itself, but I recognized the area code. It was from my hometown. The only people she knew from there were my family, so I assumed one of them had called her. She rejected the call, and I asked her who it was. She told me that it was a friend from work. I asked her about where they were from, and she told me that they lived in the city. It wasn't impossible for them to have a phone number with the area code for my town, but I just didn't believe her. She left a few minutes later, taking her phone with her to no doubt reach out to whoever that was. She had been gone for about 10 minutes when I got up to go and look for her. We were in the middle of watching a television show together, so I was just sitting there with it paused, waiting. When I found her, she was in her bedroom with her shirt off. I asked her about what she was doing, and she got kind of red in the face, as if I had never seen her naked before. She told me that she splashed some water on her shirt when she was washing her hands and was just changing. I didn't believe what she said. My gut was telling me that there was something else going on. So later that night, I grabbed her phone while she was asleep and looked through it. Unsurprisingly, when I looked through her pictures, I saw several that she'd clearly just taken earlier that night when she was topless. I searched through her contacts for the number that had called her earlier, and I saw the messages between them. The number wasn't saved, so I didn't know who it was right away. They had been exchanging pictures and sexting with each other for weeks. It all started when we were in town for my father's funeral. I felt sick to my stomach seeing that, but it got worse when I finally realized who it was. Most of the pictures were faceless, but in one of them, I saw a tattoo that I recognized. She had been texting with my uncle while I was home for my father's funeral, dealing with some of the heaviest things I had ever had to do. My wife was cheating on me with my uncle. He was my dad's brother, so it was even more disgusting that he was focused on sleeping with my wife during his funeral. I thought both of them were absolutely disgusting for their behaviors. I sent myself as many images and screenshots as I could. I would need them for our divorce hearings. I needed to think of something to do to get back at both of them for their actions. They deserved to be humiliated and have their lives turned upside down for what they did. My uncle was married, and he had 5 children. He threw all of that away to sleep with my wife. Now that I was talking to my family again, I knew that there was a birthday party coming up for my grandma. Everyone was going to be there, so I told my wife that I wanted to go, and she happily agreed to come along. I checked her phone a couple of nights after I told her, and she had set up a date to sleep with my uncle again. I was happy to see that. Originally, I had just planned on telling everybody about what happened, but if we could walk in on them in the act, that would be even better. The day of the party came along, and everything went well during the event. At the end of the night, we planned on renting one of my grandma's favorite movies and watching it together on a projector in the backyard. I knew that my wife and uncle planned to sneak away at that time. When they were gone, I tapped on my aunt's shoulder and asked her if I could talk to her. We walked away from the movie and made our way inside to have a quiet conversation. I pretended like it was about gathering photos of my father to put together in a book for my uncle because I knew how close they were. She thought it was sweet. We walked into the basement together to look for the boxes of photographs that my grandma kept. As soon as we opened the door, we saw my wife topless, straddling my uncle. I played it off like I had no idea what was happening and that I had just stumbled in there, just like my aunt had. There was a huge screaming match that ensued between my aunt and uncle. Then my wife tried to tell me that she had made a mistake and begged me to forgive her. I told her that we were done. Everybody else at the party heard what was happening, and they came down to see if everything was all right. They had to explain to everyone what had been happening between my wife and my uncle before we caught them. Everyone was disgusted by their actions. Especially my uncle's children. They were both kicked out of the house that night. Hopefully, they at least thought about how foolish they were. That they had been sleeping together before we caught them. Everyone was disgusted by their actions, especially my uncle's children. They were both kicked out of the house that night. Hopefully, they at least thought about how foolish they were. My aunt ended up divorcing my uncle and is now selling the house she was awarded in the divorce. She doesn't have to split any of the profit from that with my uncle. I ended things with my wife, and she got nothing from me. I had been burned by my family in the past, so I was smart enough to get a prenup. Every now and then, she'll text me when she's drunk and try to get back together with me. There isn't a chance in hell that I would ever do that. OP, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about the loss of your father. It sounds like you were experiencing some very complex emotions dealing with the loss. Your wife should have been there for you through all of that instead of worrying about herself. It's truly appalling that your wife and uncle would be so selfish to sleep with each other with everything your family was going through. On top of that, from what it sounds like, they met at your father's funeral. Everything about that is just disgusting. They should both be very ashamed of themselves. I'm glad you were able to catch them in the act and have everything work out for you that way. It's good that your aunt found out about it too. Honestly, if they both met at a funeral and decided to sleep together, I can't help but wonder if it was either of their first affairs. Regardless, I really hope you and your aunt are able to move past this. I hope you guys can focus on your families and open your hearts to other people again in the future.